All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Moira Donegan. I am the writer in residence here at Stanford's Michelle R. Kleiman Institute for Gender Research. And I'm honored to be here today kicking off a series of these Zoom talks that we are calling Feminism in Theory and Practice. It is a series of talks that aims to bring some leading feminist scholars, writers, artists, activists, and intellectuals here into our community at Stanford to share their work with us and to, get a little bit of a glimpse into what feminism is becoming. It is a really dynamic, fractious, changing, and I think vital social movement and field of inquiry at this historical moment. And I think there's nobody really I would prefer to do this with than Sarah Weinman, who is just a really unique and powerful writer. She is somebody who is uncommonly generous. I always learn so much from her and am so sort of entranced by her company every time we see each other. But I think, Weinman's, her clarity of writing, her kindness, her enthusiasm for sharing her insights and her research with the public and with others really shines out when you realize just how accomplished she really is. Like people who are such big deals as Sarah is don't frequently have to be as lovely as she is. So let me read her bio and just show you a little bit of how impressive our first guest is. Sarah Weinman is the author of The Real Lolita and Scoundrel, and the editor of several anthologies, most recently Evidence of Things Seen, True Crime in an Era of Reckoning. Weinman writes the monthly crime and mystery column for the New York Times Book Review, a 2020 National Magazine Award finalist for reporting, and the Calderwood Journalism Fellow at McDowell. Her work has also appeared most recently in Esquire, The Atlantic, New York, and Vanity Fair. Weinman lives in New York City, and she's here today to share with us her talk on her book in progress on the Oregon versus Readout trial and the long effort to criminalize marital rape called Without Consent. Sarah, thank you so much for being here with us.
It is truly my pleasure and honor to be here, Moira, and I especially to be the kickoff guest for this series, which I'm so excited to, come back and see more of and meet more speakers and the like. So, as I said to Moira right before starting on this talk, I have to admit I'm a little bit nervous because I'm just about done, very close. It's sort of like it, sometimes you limp to the finish line with projects, so to speak. And um, I am just at a point where I feel like I have to think about what is the project and move towards the next revision. But so as a result, I just feel in a appropriately vulnerable place to be speaking about it for the first time to all of you. And, that's a great responsibility. And it's a serious topic. I mean, my first book, The Real Lolita, was on a kidnapping and it's of a child and its relationship to a famous and controversial novel and the responsibility that that novelist, Vladimir Nabokov, had towards real life trauma and pain. And my second book, Scoundrel, was on William F. Buckley Jr.'s advocacy and championing of a convicted murderer who was responsible for the death of a teenage girl, and looks at why certain perspectives and certain people, particularly white men who profess to have some degree of above board intelligence, why are they believed more? Why are they prioritized more? And what are the costs and the consequences and the ramifications of it? So even though they're both sort of compelling true crime narratives, I also wanted to ask deeper questions with those books. And I think, in a way, what is provisionally titled Without Consent, on the landmark trial that changed America's laws and attitudes about spousal rape, I was interested in it not just as much about the people at the center of it, who I'll be discussing today, but also how that trial influenced legal jurisprudence over the course of the next 15 years in particular, but also thereafter. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And I will start my slideshow. So yes, the talk that I'll be giving today, it's called Without Consent, which is the title of my book in progress. It is indeed the landmark trial that changed American attitudes about and laws about spousal rape. And the two people whose pictures that you can see, the woman is Greta and the man is John. At the time that the picture was taken, it was December of 1978. They were both still married to one another. So Greta was known as Greta Rideout because that's what John, her then husband, he was Rideout too. I'm couching this very deliberately because Greta had a birth name, but for understandable reasons, she did not want people to use it, even though after certain things happened, that name was published in media accounts. So at the time, you know, as we'll get into, this idea of consent and not publishing people's names if they were alleged victims of sexual assault was just not done in 1978 in the same way that we kind of accept as fait accompli now. So that's one of the many things we'll be getting into in this talk. So yes, the case is Oregon versus Rideout. It was the first time that a woman who was still living with her husband charged him with rape. And the principals, as I mentioned, were Greta, who was born on October 30th, 1955, and her husband, John, who was born about a year and change after that. They had met around the mid-1970s. Greta had come from Minnesota. She'd followed her older sister to Oregon. She was a high school dropout. She was kind of dreamy. She was aimless. She had a twin brother. She had a younger brother. Her life was fine. She was originally from Arizona. They had moved back to Minnesota, where her parents were originally from. But she was kind of aimless and just looking for something to do. So she followed her sister, who had married but then divorced and had kids. And she thought that she was going to find a better life, but it didn't quite start out that way. And she was very deeply lonely. Her sister was busy. She was, being a single mom, so she had a lot of priorities. And Greta was 19 and just trying to get a job and trying to stay afloat. And then she meets this really cute guy, as she describes John at the time. And he was working as a cook. And she decides that he's somebody she wants to get to know better. And they start having sex and getting into a relationship. And at one point, they're living together at his older brother's house. John had a really crappy life. And I bring that up because I think it's really important to emphasize that perpetrators often have really damaged lives, but explanation and even mitigation is never an excuse for what they do. But I think it helps inform why John would make certain choices in his young life and then later on as well. So interestingly enough, we know him as John Rideout, but for most of his life, that's not what he was known by. He went by a different name, which was his stepfather's name. I don't even know if Rideout, the person who gave him his name, was his actual birth father. His mother, Audrey, had been married multiple times, starting when she was, I think, 16 or 17. She had one kid with her first husband, one kid with her second husband, possibly one with somebody else. And then she married John's stepfather, Anthony Glessman, and they had two other kids. It was just a lot of instability, poverty, abuse, probable childhood sexual assault, just things that a kid should never experience, but John experienced all of that. And by the time it's the mid-70s, even though John has graduated high school, because his mother has gotten yet another divorce and she's married another guy, she just was like, I can't deal with John being in the house anymore, and basically sends him to live with his older half-brother, Jack Hinkle, and his then new wife, Nancy. So that's where things are at when John and Greta meet. So they, quote, meet cute, but it really isn't. There's a lot of intimate partner violence before, during, and after the marriage. They have their only child, Jenny, in April of 76. And at that point, Greta was still unsure whether she was even going to marry John. She really didn't want to. That was an on again, off again thing. He went into the army. She was away for a long time. At one point, she decides to break off with him for good, takes Jenny back to Minnesota, but he manages to worm his way back into her life. And just more of this push-pull abuse cycle happens. He demands sex a lot, and she feels that she can never say no. And then in 1978, no, not quite there yet. And then in October of 1978, things really get very bad. So they have reunited, but he's not finding work. She has a job. He's supposed to be going to school. He's not going to school. He basically just lies around all the time demanding sex. And she's trying to go to her job, and he won't let her. And then she manages to get free and runs out the door and runs to a neighbor, gets help, tries to get help, but he finds her, and then something happens in which she describes as outright sexual assault. Back at the house, he drags her back. Jenny's a witness. He, of course, describes it as consensual sex. That, yeah, they had a fight. He hit her. There was clearly bruising on her face, but, it was all consensual. And after that, she does manage to get to the Salem Women's Crisis Center. She had first heard of it a little bit before, when she was trying to figure out if she should leave John and maybe get a divorce or things like that. And the crisis center, there's a sign where it essentially says, if she says no, it's rape. And that kind of lodges in Greta's head, like, oh, okay. And as I'll get into, the fact that she could even press charges against her husband for raping her was a radical act. And this is why. So 50 years ago, marital rape was not a crime. And I'm going to repeat that. 50 years ago, 1974, marital rape was not considered to be a crime anywhere, not in 50 states of America, not in Canada, not in the United Kingdom, not anywhere. And that is because, according to common law, and a particular figure from the 17th century in England named Lord Matthew Hale, who was a judge, was that a husband had a perpetual right to sex from his wife, who was his property and had no rights of her own. He had written a treatise that was only published 60 years after his death in 1736, called The History of the Pleas of the Crown, in which Hale spelled out essentially all of his big jurisprudence decisions. He was known to sentence people who he believed to be witches to burn at the stake. Misogyny was his bread and butter. But he wasn't the only one. And the fact that this treatise appeared 60 years after his death, he had actually said explicitly in a document before he died that he did not want this published. And so there is a weird irony that the very document that so much common law has relied on in the centuries since, that said women were the property of their husbands, that they could never say no, that they were essentially in a perpetual state of consent with their husbands no matter what, that this was published without Lord Hale's consent. So this was kind of the law, not just of the land in the UK, in the Commonwealth, but even in the United States of America. It's like, okay, so 1776 happens, but they don't fix this for a very long time. And the first arguments that marital rape was a crime emerged during the initial, so the first wave feminist movement, the suffragist movement around 1848 or thereabouts. And I want to make clear too that when we are talking about spousal rape in this context, it's really talking about white women and the fact that white women, when they were married, were considered to be their husband's property. Black women didn't even get that, quote, honor and privilege, because at the time they were enslaved. And until 1861, they couldn't even file rape charges against their attackers, let alone be considered victims of spousal rape. It just was unheard of, like alien. So there are some very different conversations that we have to have with respect to Black women and women of color. Indigenous women certainly were not afforded any of these protections then and certainly later on. But looking at the larger picture, we have to understand how enslavement and marital property kind of work together, but also against each other. That white women, in wanting to assert that marital rape was a crime, did not give that same outreach towards women who didn't look like them or act like them. So, as I mentioned, spousal rape was not a crime half a century ago, but with rape reform laws and other changes owing to second wave feminism, 1974 was also the year that women were allowed to get credit cards of their own and buy houses and get mortgages and assert autonomy in ways that still exist. The year before, of course, was Roe v. Wade. So things were happening that were seismic, which of course would lead to backlash. And we would actually see this pretty quickly with the criminalization of spousal rape. So Michigan and Delaware were the first states to introduce bills that would make spousal rape a crime. And then the next year, Nebraska modernized their rape laws to get rid of marital exceptions. And South Dakota actually outlawed it explicitly. There's actually a wonderful paper by a scholar named Molly Johnson who goes into this fascinating history of how South Dakota was at the forefront because for a brief window, they had a Democratic state Senate and women who were really at the forefront to kind of push this forward. But that progress, it lasted about a year and a half because by 1977, South Dakota no longer had no longer criminalized spousal rape, and they would not start to fix that until the early 90s. By 1977, Oregon passes its spousal rape law, SB 503. And this law was pretty radical. It did not include any exceptions for spouses still living together. So at this point, we have Michigan, Delaware, Nebraska is on the move. Iowa is also on board. And then New Jersey's next with their spousal rape scheduled to go into effect on January 1st, 1979. So that is the landscape for this criminal trial involving the Rideouts. Now, initially, when John Rideout was arrested in October of 1978, it took a few days after the crime took place. It was just a local story. There was an unbylined Salem Statesman headline, which just said, "Wife accuses husband of rape." It was an October 1978 article. So at that point, only the local Salem, Oregon papers cared. And I should also mention Salem is about an hour outside of Portland. If you think of Portland as a very liberal town, Salem is more of a purple state kind of place. It's the state capital. It's got an interesting mix of some liberal types, some very conservative, and I'm talking about it in sort of 1978 terms, where they just were not ready for what was about to happen. They were too small a town. They were too sort of not so much blinkered in their thinking, but just like they didn't have like a multiplicity of opinions about all sorts of stuff. Like they just were not ready for what was about to happen. So the first big national piece was in the Los Angeles Times in early December of 78. Betty Liddick was a feature reporter, and she was interested in the bigger picture of the story of, wait, there's never been a woman who was still married to her husband who charged him with rape, and we need to talk about spousal rape. And it's only 5 years out from Roe v. Wade, and feminism is causing so much controversy and conversation and debate. And there's the sense that there are battle lines drawn between the sexes. So this case seems like a good way to examine all these things. So she comes to Salem and she interviews Greta. It's her first major interview. She talks to John, talks to his mother, and really gets a sense of the poverty that he's coming from, but She talks to the lawyers who are, the prosecutor is Gary Gortmacher, who is a sort of big, tall fellow, likes to have a booming voice. And there's this sense that he doesn't really know what to make of it, but he'll at least pretend to try to prosecute it to the best of his ability. And at that point, John had just retained Salem's most prominent defense lawyer, a guy named Charles Burt, who at that point was known for, if there was a major crime and a defense was necessary, he was the guy to call. He had defended the wife of a shoe fetish killer named Jerry Brudos, and she had been arrested and tried for being an accomplice and doing worse than that, and he got her off, rightfully so, as it turns out. But he was brought on because clearly this was going to be a much bigger case than people anticipated, and he was kind of the guy to do it. He was much more of a soft-spoken person. He had had polio and was disabled as a result of it, but overcame that disability and kind of used his smarts and wiles to the best of his advantage. So this article happens. Then there are more articles all over the place in Washington and New York. The networks start picking it up. The media presence becomes so comprehensive. There are newspapers from Germany, Australia, the UK, Canada, all over. It gets so pervasive that the local papers in Salem devote not one, but two articles to the media presence where they're talking about, okay, here are these camera guys, and they're talking about placement in the court. And why? And this is all happening because Salem just doesn't know what to do with it. At least the judge, Richard Barber, was smart enough not to allow cameras in the courtroom during trial. So that seal would not be broken for a few more years where you had a televised trials. But even just being right outside the courtroom, the media would do things like get in an elevator en masse with John Rideout and interview him, and he doesn't have his lawyer, or they would try to track Greta down and get her to say something. So as all this is happening, John is being kind of primped up to look the part of a clean-cut guy. Burt actually arranges for him to get like shots to help out his acne. He gets better clothing. He gets a real haircut. He just looks like somebody who can present well on camera. Greta, however, is completely off-site because, as we all know, if you press charges about sexual assault, you are not the plaintiff. You, the state, is the one that's pressing charges. So even though the case really centers on Greta and eventually her sexual history, she is not a presence in the courtroom until she's called to testify. She can't even be in the courtroom to witness from the Women's Crisis Center. And that's where she is the whole time. Oregon versus Rideout gets underway. So this is around just a little bit before Christmas of 1978. There's a jury of 8 women and 4 men. And a very consequential ruling happens in a pretrial motion that most people ignore, which is that Greta's sexual history is allowed in. And so as a result, the fact that she was allegedly sexually assaulted by John's older brother, Jack, the fact that she made jokes about having a lesbian relationship with her best friend, which was clearly a lie, but she said that to kind of needle John. And all of that was used against her. The fact that she had multiple abortions, which again, only a few years removed from Roe v. Wade, this was brought up to paint Greta as a slut, as unstable, as someone who could lie. And so the trial proceeds, even though there are 26 prosecution witnesses, and most of them back up Greta's account of being sexually assaulted by John. And there are just 4 defense witnesses. And John gets his day on the stand too, where he makes his claim that it was all consensual. It was essentially a she said, he said kind of trial. She said rape, he said it was consensual, and the media is all present to take account. But because Charles Burt, the defense lawyer, puts on a much better show than does the prosecutor, Gary Gortmacher, it's not terribly surprising, even though it is terribly depressing, that after 4 votes, the jury takes 2.5 hours to deliberate and acquits John Rideout 2 days after Christmas on 1978. And yes, the crowd does burst into applause. Greta is back at the home of the Salem Women's Crisis Center when she gets the news. And even though her testimony was very compelling and believable, she was not believed. And jurors at the time were like, well, there was reasonable doubt. We didn't think that she presented herself well. We thought that there were just too many weird things happening with her testimony. So understandably, she was devastated. And she said women will now have to think twice before going to the law. So it's the end of 1978. She has filed for divorce from John, but she has nowhere to go. She can't stay at the advocate's house anymore. That woman has several children of her own. She's given up her house for several weeks. Greta can't go back to the apartment where the assault took place, but she can't find a job because everybody knows who she is in town. She doesn't have the money to go anywhere. So within a couple of weeks, she and John get on the phone to discuss custody arrangements, and they decide to meet in person, go away to Portland to just talk things out. And by the end of that conversation, they are back together. It is early January of 1979. They come back to Salem and they let reporters know. So there's a big piece in one of the local papers essentially announcing that they are reunited. And then within a few days, they're on Good Morning America. So in this picture, you can see Greta and John are sitting together. They are speaking with one of the reporters and explaining what brought them back together. They sort of claim that, their love of their daughter, their love of each other, their love of Jesus was going to put things right. And the country as a whole kind of turned against Greta. They viewed her as the person who wasted their time. People wrote in op-eds saying, why did this trial even happen? It was a waste of taxpayer money. Why did they do this? They're just a couple of rubes. They're not very smart. Even the media people who were covering this felt that Greta and John were just not very bright people. And they felt like their time was wasted too. So there was just no quarter was going to be had, particularly for Greta. For John, it was like, well, whatever. He was just a man. But the reunion does not last very long. It's only a couple of months. And by March of 1979, the marriage is over. Greta has taken Jenny. She has initiated her divorce filing. It's granted in April. It seems to be amicable at first, but by the end of August, John tries to break into Greta's apartment. He's arrested for trespassing and for trying to break down her door, and he serves 40 days in prison. So after a landmark case, the first time that a woman was charging her husband with spousal rape, the end result is 40 days in prison. This really gets the attention, the whole thing does, of a very interesting activist named Laura X. Laura X, who's still alive, she's in her 80s, and she lives in Berkeley. I'll just be really brief with her life. She was born and raised by very wealthy parents, the kind of parents whose names are on buildings in St. Louis. She was, just like her mother, something called a veiled prophet queen, which is essentially like being a debutante on steroids with like cosplay. You have to see the pictures of the video to believe it. Ellie Kemper, who was on The Incredible Kimmy Schmidt, had also been a veiled prophet queen many decades thereafter. It's kind of wild stuff. And for Laura in particular, there was a real disconnect because she had already told her parents as a teen that she was a socialist. She just didn't really want to have anything to do with wealth. She'd gone to Vassar. She was like full tilt Marxist, but her father basically forced her to come back and perform in this pageantry because he had donated a bunch of money. And as the top donor is like, you're going to do this. So she felt she had no choice. She did her year, went back to Vassar, Eventually landed in New York, where she was part of some civil rights groups there, moved to Berkeley, was part of the free speech movement, and eventually founded the Women's History Research Center in 1968, and also worked on some of the early second wave feminist zines. Basically, she knew anybody and everybody in that movement. And when she read of the Rideout case on Christmas morning, she was with friends, having she'd had a nice Christmas Eve dinner, wakes up, sees the paper, and is like, what is this all about? And gets on the phone, starts calling people. And by the time of the acquittal and the time of the reunion, she has begun an organization that is now known as the National Clearinghouse for Marital and Date Rape. And her first big activist project is to lobby for the criminalization of spousal rape in California because it wasn't a crime. So by the fall of that year, California will pass its first draft of the spousal rape law. Meanwhile, as all this is happening, the media does not go away. The Rideout case is now going to be a television film. And as you can see, this is an ad for the film that was made for it. It's October of 1980, and it's a TV movie, so you can't expect too much in the way of subtlety. And as I'll read out, the tagline is, Greta Rideout loved her husband, but he abused her love and her body. Finally, she had no other choice. She cried rape, the remarkable true story of that Oregon couple you read about. And yeah, Linda Hamilton played Greta. A very young Mickey Rourke played John in what I think is terribly appropriate casting. And Rip Torn was cast as the defense lawyer, Charles Burt. Conchata Ferrell's also in it as the victim advocate. So I'll just say briefly about this film that it's actually better than it has a right to be. It tries to be faithful. It relied on news accounts and court records, and the producers were two youngish women. It was their first big project, and they really wanted to portray what happened sensitively. The problem is that the script used a romance frame. And so it really was like boy meets girl, girl accuses boy of sexual assault, boy and girl go through trial, he's acquitted, they reunite, and the movie kind of ends after the reunion, even though by 1980, John is completely out of Greta's life. He has left a very strange and threatening voicemail on her answering machine, but she and Jenny have gone out of state and are just trying to like live their lives. So the movie airs, and then over the next 13 or so years, that's when the activism really starts to kick into gear. So in September of 79, it's the first real conviction. So what happened is that men had been convicted of raping their estranged wives or wives they had divorced, but none had been convicted of the rape of their wives that they were still living with until James Chrétien was in Massachusetts. And that led to Massachusetts' law being codified. As I mentioned before, around the same time as when California passed its spousal rape law, it would be revised many times over the next decades, but until 79, there was none at all. 7 more states, Connecticut, Florida, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, New Jersey, Iowa, and Minnesota had eliminated their spousal rape exemptions by 1982. 2 years after that, there were landmark cases in Florida, which is State v. Ryder, and New York, which is People versus Liberta. Liberta in particular, he was convicted, but then he sought to overturn it, saying that there was no spousal rape law in the books. So the appeals court actually kind of invented a spousal rape law in their ruling by saying that under equal protection, women had just as much right to assert that they had been violated as any other woman who was not involved or not married to their partner. And so this sort of slow wave of criminalization is happening, and people are talking about it. There are episodes on Donahue. I think at one point Oprah Winfrey would feature it. And in 1993, North Carolina is the last state to make spousal rape illegal. So it all sounds good, right? Like, finally, spousal rape is illegal. It took until 1993, which is pretty recent history for this to happen. But if you think that's the end of the story, think again. Because so many exceptions, so many loopholes, so much backlash still remains and probably will remain for the foreseeable future. So I will mention, there will be chapters in the book about this, but in the early 90s, which is of course at around the same time when a certain Supreme Court justice was confirmed despite being a prominent sexual harasser, when you had Susan Faluti's Backlash being published and books like Katie Roiphe's The Morning After. So we were really in backlash territory. Two prominent cases of spousal rape led to acquittals. One, which is the John Bobbitt case. But what we know about that, there's so much of it, and yet what I have found is that people had not really realized that John went on trial first for marital sexual assault in Virginia and was acquitted. And then Lorena Gallo went on trial for assault and, cutting off his penis. And then she was acquitted. So it was a very strange replay of some of the same dynamics of the rideouts, but on a much greater and more sensational scale than even the rideouts were. So that's how far or not so far things had come in 15 years, because by then we'd had televised trials, we had 24/7 cable, we just had real tabloid frenzies. But the year before is a case that I'm actually even more outraged by. It involved Trish Crawford and her then husband, Dale Crawford. They were in South Carolina. He violently sexually assaulted her and filmed it. There was bondage involved, and it was just a horrific, horrific spectacle. But his defense lawyer successfully argued that it was all consensual. Don't believe what you see on the screen. He was acquitted. They went on Larry King together to talk about the case. Trish became an activist for a while, but then eventually faded away from the spotlight to understandably live out her life in privacy. Dale, meanwhile, married again, and in 2004 he was arrested for murdering his wife and is currently in prison for that. So in the aftermath of that acquittal, I do find it interesting to note that South Carolina's spousal rape law is one of the worst on the books. Essentially, it's almost in name only. If the punishment for it is nowhere near equal to if you're raped by a stranger or even someone you're not married to, and if you're incapacitated, it's not considered rape at all. The loopholes and exceptions continue. Minnesota didn't even eliminate theirs until 2019, when a woman named Jenny Thiessen, who had discovered that she had been assaulted by her husband because he took video of it, realized that she couldn't press charges and successfully lobbied the state legislature to fix the loophole. California didn't remove their last exceptions to their spousal rape laws until 2023. And just this year, West Virginia introduced a bill to get rid of the exception to their spousal rape law, but that came about on the back of an anti-trans bill. So it's interesting, depressing, humiliating, infuriating that we just can't get uniformity on criminalizing spousal rape, which seems to be such a no-brainer, but it's coming at a time when so much is being rolled back. We know about Dobbs. We know about efforts to revive and kind of zombify the Comstock Act. We know just today that Arizona the Supreme Court upheld their 1864 law that would essentially be a total abortion ban. We know about efforts to get rid of birth control. I've basically been expecting the shoe to drop about spousal rape for as long as I've been working on this project, but particularly since Dobbs happened in 2022. And that's just in the US. Marital rape is still not a crime in so many countries. India is trying to criminalize it without a lot of success. There are countries in the Far East, in Africa. Just, this is not a national problem. This is a global problem. And then finally, more or less, what happened to Greta and John? I mentioned that she and her daughter moved to the Midwest and lived out their lives in relative obscurity and privacy. John kind of bounced around between Salem and other towns and way northern California, Humboldt County. He's not heard from really for 35 years. Who knows what he's even up to? I'm still trying to fully sort that out. But in 2016, he's back in the news because he is arrested for sexually assaulting two other women. One is an acquaintance, the other an on-again, off-again girlfriend. Please excuse my spelling errors. I clearly wrote this in fury. There is a trial. It is unlike the 1978 trial. There's barely any media in attendance, but he is convicted for rape and sodomy. The sodomy charge was reversed because of a technicality, but in 2022, he is retried again and convicted. I actually attended that trial. And John Rideout will not be eligible for parole until 2041. When Greta first learned of John's arrest, she said, "I knew it would happen again. I'm glad the victims came forward." And when a local reporter for the Salem Statesman Journal asked if it was all worth it, Greta said, "I'm really happy I went through it. Who knows what would have happened to me? I made everyone aware of what he was capable of." So the thing is, so much has happened. The efforts to criminalize spousal rape technically counts as successful activism, but the work remains unfinished. In 2010, there was a CDC estimate that nearly 1 in 10 women were raped by an intimate partner, and 16.9% of them, and I should add almost 9% of men, had experienced sexual violence other than rape by an intimate partner at some point in their lives. 77% of such rapes are not reported, and spousal rape prosecutions remain quite rare. This is even more crucial to discuss when the bodily autonomy of the female identified are under added threat because of Dobbs, Comstock, etc. And I guess I will close with kind of a flipping of an infamous line. When California was first passing its first attempt at a spousal rape law in 1979, there was a state senator named Bob Wilson. He had attended a dinner and at one point cracked, "If you can't rape your wife, who can you rape?" And the thing is, he kept claiming that this was a joke, but I'm sorry, rape jokes are just not funny. And what I think I've learned with this project is, if you can rape your wife, who else can you rape? Because what I found, at least anecdotally, in the not just the Rideout case, but in some of the other cases that I will cover in this book, is that men who sexually assault their wives tend to recidivate, and they recidivate at a rate that seems to be a lot higher than other perpetrators. And what I'm hoping is that by the time the book publishes, I can get more concrete data to that effect. But certainly anecdotally, that men who rape their wives are much more likely to be repeat offenders, much more likely to be violent, much more likely to do this again and again. And as a result, I do feel like this project has kind of taught me a lot about the dark side of marriage in a way that I was not expecting. But more to the point, I think that it shows just the unbelievable radical heroism that Greta displayed all the way back in 1978 when she pressed charges against John. This was something she just felt like she had to do. She didn't consider herself to be a heroine. She was punished again and again and again. And so many women have been punished so much since then. And even just telling this story, if it can just lead to a little bit less punishment, then I will have done the best work that I can do. So thank you very much. This is my contact info. These are my books. And with that, I think that's the end of my talk.
Sarah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I've learned so much from you, as I always do. Before we move into the Q&A, I'm going to ask our wonderful audience members, who I'm so grateful we're able to attend, to use the Q&A feature. It's right at the bottom of the Zoom. Just type in your questions there and we'll be able to see them and get them answered. And that keeps everything very organized. And Sarah, I wanted to thank you for how lucid you were in showing us the stakes of this Oregon versus Readout case. I think in this moment after Dobbs, we have a lot of like really thoughtful consideration about how the state can, claim ownership or usurp the right to determine women's bodies, right? And trans people's bodies as well. But what you've shown so beautifully is that claim of ownership and use entitlement to women's bodies is also something that a lot of people have in the private sphere, right? Not just the state, but in fact, many individuals can also make this claim. And of course, the state often acts as their accomplice in that kind of usurpation of women's bodies. And I also really am so grateful that you spend time thinking about how these grand social changes happen on the backs of real people who have to live with the consequences, both of being symbols and of having these experiences in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really important, particularly as I talk about the efforts to criminalize state by state, that every time there was some landmark case, I try to read up about the actual case and the initial people who were involved in it, and in some instances actually was able to speak with the women at the center of it. And to a fault, they all expressed how much going through that experience kind of destroyed their lives. In the Liberta case, I did speak with the woman at the center of it, and she basically said that she still lives in fear of her ex-husband, that even though he went to prison and he did serve time, that she felt so much safer whenever he was either in prison or just institutionalized or incapacitated. And when he was out, she just felt like something would happen because he kept stalking her. And that's the thing. Like even John Bobbitt, as we know from the documentary Lorena that came out a few years ago, she even describes how he would send text messages, he would send letters, he would message her on Facebook, and she's just like, I cut his dick off, and why won't he leave me alone? And what is it about these men that they just feel a forever entitlement to their former wives, that they feel a forever entitlement to women? That's what came through, particularly in researching the Rideout story, that John Rideout just felt this perpetual entitlement, that it informed his delusion about how he engaged in sex and the fact that it was constantly non-consensual. But in his mind, it was always, well, they wanted it. And, he would just tell lies because he believes them. And it's weird to say that he's sort of a pathetic figure. And I actually think that even within his family, he's not the worst offender, which is saying something. But I think that's also important to impart that these are not outsized villains. These are just run-of-the-mill guys. And there's so many of them. So many of them. And that's the scourge of intimate partner violence.
Yeah, I think something that feminist writing will teach you is that men do not have to be particularly intelligent or gifted or even inventive in their evil to have a life-altering damage imposed on their behalf on women's lives. I'm going to move now to a question from our audience member, the very distinguished Professor Deborah Turkheimer. Hi, Deborah. I'm so glad you were able to join us. Asks, your project raises such interesting questions about the function of criminal prosecution and advancing gender equality. Of course, today many feminists oppose turns to the criminal legal system. How does your project speak to the tension between improving and forsaking criminal justice?
That is such a good question, and I think I'm still actually grappling with it. I think what will help is if I can eventually get a hold of Melissa Jura-Grant's A Woman is Against the Law, which it might actually come out concurrent to when my book comes out. But I think there's an inherent struggle. Like on the one hand, second wave feminism did lead to the creation of sex crimes units, and it did foster a lot of progress. But I think, as we can see in the story of Linda Fairstein, who was the head of a sex crimes unit in New York City, and who also oversaw the unit that led to the wrongful conviction of 5 men who were not responsible for the rape of the Central Park jogger. And I know this case very well because I wrote about the actual women who were assaulted and harmed, and in one instance murdered by the actual perpetrator. And the fact that he got away with it as long as he did, he was arrested for those crimes within a few months, but they didn't even think to connect what happened to Trisha Miley to the murder of Lourdes Gonzalez and the rape of these other women, because they were so blinkered by the idea that a bunch of Black teenagers were wilding in Central Park, even though on the face of it, the story just sounds even more ridiculous. And Fairstein still clings to this idea that the 5 had some involvement to it. And I think we have seen the ramifications of that as a result. So even though I think that spousal rape is a crime and it should be criminalized, and men do need to be published, and there is some room in the criminal legal system for this, I don't want to make a blanket statement that I think prosecution is great, because it's not. And they get it wrong so many times. Mandatory minimums can be way too high. But I also think that not having some kind of law also harms women at a far greater frequency. So I think it's just, there is this tension, and I'm not sure how adequately it can be resolved at this point, especially when I think when you talk about spousal rape, it gets into the tension too between privacy and equal protection and bodily autonomy. On the one hand, I mean, Roe v. Wade depended on privacy. It should have been equal protection. Maybe it would have stood the test of time a little more strongly. Griswold is about privacy. But if you take away Griswold, then does that mean that spousal rape is more likely to happen, less likely to happen, more likely to be a crime, less likely to be a crime? I'm still kind of sorting all that out.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to a question from Sophia Weiss Goitiandia. I'm sorry, Sophia, if I'm butchering your last name. Sophia asks, thank you so much for your amazing presentation and necessary work. Often, these trials seem to collapse a conflict of credibilities. Who do we epistemically trust more, the she said or the he said? Likely because testimony is one of the central pieces of evidence in these cases. I'm wondering about your thoughts on what that means for how we address sexual assault cases as a society. Are there ways for the law to stop falling short in these cases? Should we find other ways to deal with them altogether?
I do feel like that's one of the central questions, especially so one of the parts of my background is that I have a master's in forensic science. So as a result, I do kind of trust scientific inquiry a lot more readily than I do eyewitness testimony, because eyewitness testimony often gets it wrong. But I think the evidence of sexual assault, because it is so often disbelieved and because it is so often leading to sort of the destruction of the body and the mind, and the fact that it just like rips a hole in the fabric of your very consciousness and existence. In this case, I'm much more inclined to go with testimony than I am empirical evidence, because there often isn't empirical evidence with sexual assault. It really is a question of who do you believe and who don't you? So all I know is what I am able to witness and impart from reading court transcripts. And also, as I mentioned, the 2022 trial, when one of John Rideout's victims had to get up and testify again to what happened to her. And I sat in the courtroom and I heard her, and I could just, like, the credibility just radiated off of her. Like, she didn't want to be there. She had memory gaps. She was upfront about it, but she just told it like it happened. And Rideout didn't testify in 2022, but he had in 2017. And he just spun lie after lie after lie that could be picked apart in cross-examination. But somehow what seems plainly evident now was not so much in 1978. And what has helped, I think, too, is that, we have rape shield laws, we exclude sexual history as prejudicial, we try to concentrate on the actual assault that happened for the most part. So many people still get it wrong, so many people still won't report. I'm not sure that they should. I don't think that the criminal legal system is set up to help victims of sexual assault because, as I mentioned, it's not the victim whose name is on the docket. This isn't a civil case. It's the state. And the state has a differing agenda than does the victim of a sexual assault. And what I think is ultimately important, and I'm sorry to ramble, but I'm still kind of working this out in my head, is that I wish there was a way where the criminal legal system could figure out how to keep the best interests of sexual assault victims so that they don't get traumatized over and over and over again, that people come to it from a place of compassion and not from some adversarial game of winners and losers.
Thank you. One of our last questions, I think this might be the last one we have time for. An anonymous attendee asks, have you ever come across or developed any statistics on how often marital rape occurs? Apologies if I missed this in the talk.
Unfortunately, there are not that many recent statistics. So because marital rape is still very understudied, I would say that the two best books on the subject, one was Rape and Marriage by Diana Russell, which was first published in 1982 and then revised in 1990. She had done a survey that emerged from a study she did with several researchers in the mid-70s around Berkeley and Northern California. And in that study of about 930 women, 14% reported being sexually assaulted by their husbands. And that is widely considered to be an undercount. I think a similar percentage emerged in a subsequent book by David Finkelhor and Kirsty Illo called License to Rape. It came out in 1985. And they did a survey of women in Massachusetts. And again, it seemed to be about 14% were willing to say that they were raped by their husbands. Obviously, now we also have to discuss that marriage doesn't just involve men and women. And what is also understudied is intimate partner violence in queer relationships, in those that do not fit with comfortable binaries. So there's just so much opportunity to study what is going on in intimate partner relationships that lead to marriage, and even though like domestic unions, and to hopefully get much better statistics. I had mentioned that CDC count in 2010. That's still 14 years ago. So we do need better data.
I think that your forthcoming book is going to be such a wonderful contribution to this conversation. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us. I learned so much. I'm always so honored to talk to you, and it's just wonderful to be here in your company and basking in your brilliance. So thank you
Thank
so
you,
much
Moira.
for your
I'm so
talk.
glad that I could deliver this talk to all of you, and thank you all for such thought-provoking questions as I go back into this draft and continue to revise it. And the hope is that Without Consent, if that ends up being the title, which I hope it will be, because I feel like it just encapsulates the entire project, it will be published by Echo, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. They have been my publisher since 2018, in late 25 or early 26.
Wonderful. Sarah Wyman, thank you so much.
Thank you.